Okay, welcome back, everybody. We are going to have Drew Hancock-Teed now introduce our next speaker, Ryan DeCaire.
Wait, is this working?
It is.
Fantastic. Hello, everyone. It is my honor to introduce my former professor, Ryan DeCaire. Ryan DeCaire is a current instructor and former student of Onkwawenna Kentyohkwa, a community-based immersion program in the Six Nations of the Grand River, Ontario, and is assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics and the Centre for Indigenous Studies at the University of Toronto. He's an exemplary member of the new generation of adult speakers of Kentyohkwa, an accomplished teacher of the language, and a research linguist who has published papers both on the morphological structure of his language and on language utilization. Please join me in welcoming Ryan DeCaire.
Well, so good to see you again, Drew. And thank you so much, Nick, for having me here today. Thank you to the whole group who put on this conference. And it was so lovely to hear all the earlier presenters. And just want to thank you for sharing your knowledge with me. So, to you all. Greetings to everyone. So he just introduced me, and that's pretty well it. And my name is Ryan DeCaire, and I'm from a small Mohawk community called Wahta. There I was born and raised, and I am currently a avid language learner and trying to pass it on to as many people as possible, as often as I can. And I'm so happy to be here, and I feel privileged to be with every one of you, wherever you are throughout the world. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. And I'm just going to share my screen now. Hopefully everybody's hearing me okay.
Sounds great from where I am.
Good. So everybody, like I said, what's going on, greetings. And I had a bit of a discussion with Nick yesterday through email saying, I'm not really sure if my topic's going to be in line with exactly what you hope, but, we had a discussion around me wanting to talk more about the bigger picture. And you'll notice that the previous presenters, a lot of discussion was amazing about really specific methods and really specific challenges that we're experiencing associated with passing language on to new learners. And I think that's extremely important. And what I also think is extremely important, and what we often forget to really do, is ground our everyday actions in a long-term goal, and putting our minds together, as we call it, to have a one-mindedness in our future goals to where we want to really end up one day. And that's what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about. And I'm especially going to focus that towards adult acquisition. And this is something that's one of my passions, because I'm an adult, and I started learning the language as an adult, and I did it mostly, for, you could call it selfish reasons, but really just trying to connect with my people, my community, and to be part of my identity. It wasn't until later that I started realizing a little bit about, wow, maybe adults are playing a bigger role than we think, or they should play a bigger role than we think. And after years of thinking about this, I thought, well, we should be sharing more ideas around what can we do to increase adult acquisition, and why is that even important? Why is that important to language revitalization? And why is that important to our communities in the long run? So if you don't know me, I can see by the participants here, there's a few of you I know well. Some of you I've heard of and know your names, but I've wanted to get to know you. I don't know you at all. So I'm just going to introduce myself just a little bit. Here's a small map a good friend of mine drew up, and it contains all the Haudenosaunee or Iroquoian communities. And for me, this is where I'm from, as I mentioned, in Wahta. There's only about a handful of first language speakers left, of which I think I'm probably the only second language speaker there. And I spent a lot of time in Oswego, and that's where Brian's from. He talked earlier, because he created one of the first adult immersion programs, where I had to move away to spend some time in the language, at least to develop some kind of oral proficiency at Onkwawenna Kentyohkwa, an adult immersion school. And I've also spent a lot of time in Kahnawake, and this is a really well-known community in all of indigenous countries throughout Canada, the United States, and the world for language revitalization. And a lot of people look to Kahnawake for their innovative work since the 70s and what they've done to revitalize Kentyohkwa there. Especially have an amazing program called Onkwawenna. It's an adult immersion program where I also attended and became a principal instructor there as well, living with first language speakers for a number of years. But now I also spend a lot of time in Toronto. A lot of people think I live there, but I'm mostly in Wachter or in Oswego, being part of my speech community as often as I can as possible. Although at Toronto, I'm, as Drew mentioned, a professor there in linguistics and Indigenous studies. If you're interested, one thing that people know me about, or one reason why they know me is because of this video. It's a before and after to see a young boy with very little knowledge of the language to progress to a certain level after 2 years of constant study. A lot of people thought this was impressive because they haven't really seen that, like a before and after type thing. And but now we have a lot of before and after videos that were done before me, and now there's many who have gone way beyond my proficiency level in less time. This shows that our focus on adult immersion over the 20 years, I think Brian mentioned, is getting better and better and better every year with constant anecdotal evidence and research and just using our students as we say, guinea pigs to improve things every single year. And I can see actually there's some speakers here who are second language learners listening today that have gone beyond what I've done. And I want to acknowledge them as well. You'll notice right here is a picture of one of our adult immersion classes after their 2 years of graduation, at graduation. And here's another one in Kahnawake, which I was a teacher a few years back. Another thing I do is constantly spend time with first language speakers, any chance I can get, pandemic or pre-pandemic. I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well as, how has it impacted this kind of interaction. Also been engaged in documentation projects like this one, which is about a 3-hour documentary completely in this language, this dialect of Kentyohkwa or Mohawk, accompanied by a book with all the transcriptions to be focused on advanced language learning for second language speakers. You'll notice here some time I spent with elders doing interviews. So just getting to know a little about me, this is really what I want to talk to you about. Talking about Indigenous language revitalization. Hopefully we're all thinking about what revitalization means to you and what that goal is, because a lot of us don't think about what that means. And a lot of us, actually, when we're at the same table, if we don't talk about it and really discuss it, we sometimes are looking towards different goals. And I'm going to talk about why adult acquisition is so important and how that relates to the pandemic and how that relates to technology. One thing I have to mention is that, I don't do a lot with technology. And I felt that the pandemic has had more of a negative impact than a positive impact on language learning, obviously. But there's things that I do want to point out in this presentation that counterintuitively, there's a lot of things that technology is doing to help us, and the pandemic is actually doing to help us, that we maybe never would have realized originally without those things existing or happening. So I'm going to use Kentyohkwa as an example, but if you're not dealing with Kentyohkwa, maybe you're dealing with Mohican, maybe you're dealing with Anishinaabe, it doesn't really matter. It could be any of the languages throughout Canada, the United States. But I'm going to use Mohawk as an example because most language, and I'm going to say 80% of our languages that still have speakers are almost always in a very similar situation when we measure their vitality, right? So this is a big chart full of numbers, right? So I know it's confusing and too much to look at, but I'll try and pinpoint what I'm trying to get you to look at. And this is numbers of speakers. So we'll notice that there are 9, 4, and 1. These are our communities. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 communities there of families that never lost intergenerational transmission. So 9 in this community, 4 and 1 in this. And that's pretty good, all considering. But when we calculate all these numbers up, really for the majority of all of our communities, we're lucky if 5% of our people speak it. And that's combining second language speakers and first language speakers. Most communities are maybe at 3%, some are at 2%, and some are just above 1%. And of course, that with to take into account how we measure a speaker, and I'm going to get into that. Now let's look at re-establishment of intergenerational transmission, because there has been some, and this has especially taken place over the last 20 years. Let's look at families where there's children who are first language speaking children who were made to be first language speaking children by second language speakers. You'll notice in these communities that in Kahnawake, this one community here, and Oswego, they seem to have a larger number than these other communities. And the point I'm trying to make there is it is highly likely that the reason why that is because these communities have adult immersion programs that have been in those communities and become almost an institution within their language revitalization strategies. So I want you to think about that and how that maybe might have an impact on your language. Now, of course, we got to be talking and thinking about goals. Some of us are familiar with the GIDS, or Graded Intergenerational Disruption Scale, made famous by Joshua Fishman. It's been updated to be eGIDS now. And when you look at our languages, and this is similar to many Indigenous languages across Canada and the United States, most of them are threatened, shifting, or moribund, meaning that most of those speakers who have any degree of proficiency are above 60. If, for most of us, even if we're lucky, some, for some communities, in my community, above 80, right? So in my specific community, it's probably closer to nearly extinct. And well, it's good to be certain about where we want to go. And as Kentyohkwa or Mohawk people, most of us, our goal, who are involved in language revitalization anyway, we really want to get to this, what they call 6A, or vigorous, which means face-to-face communication, all generations. There's intergenerational transmission between peer groups, right? And when we're thinking about, biodiversity as well, it almost has to be self-sustaining. And this is kind of our goal, not separate from English, of course. We're also seeking to have a strong bilingual and even multilingual society. So why am I even showing you that? Well, because I want people to think about how that matters. Considering the vitality of your language, what should we be concerned about now? Fishman said this. He said that mother tongues are self-sustaining, and a new generation doesn't wait until it goes to school to get its mother tongue. It usually gets its mother tongue at home and in the community, in the neighborhood, among loved ones, the ones shaping the identity of the child. Now imagine if right now with the pandemic, imagine all of our parents who had kids right now, they all had a decent proficiency in Mohawk. They couldn't send them to school, but at least they had their parents at the home. They'd still be pretty safeguarded to continue to be speaking the language. And wouldn't that be nice? They wouldn't be depending on sending their kid to school. They wouldn't be worried about making sure that they get on Zoom so they can have access to the language. Let's think about what Krauss said. He said that school programs can do more harm than good sometimes, insofar as they shift the responsibility for transmitting the language in the home to the school, at best such a poor alternative. Now, the reason why I say this is because there's a lot of people, and I'm speaking to mostly those within Indigenous communities. There's been a large focus since the 70s, especially, to say that it's the children are the future. Of course, children are the future, but in doing so and saying so, often the weight or the burden of the future of the language is put on them. And we've come to learn, it's taken quite a long time, and I wasn't the one who figured it out, that in order for children to speak, it's the parents that have to speak. It's the ones shaping the identity of the child. And wow, when intergenerational transmission is broken, it is, as we all know, it's so hard to develop adult speakers. It's hard, right? And I think it's hard for reasons that we think it's other reasons that it actually is. I'm going to talk to you about what are the challenges. But what we're really concerned about in order to, develop this speech community is speaking. And I know that seems kind of obvious, but for some it doesn't come out that way. We're really focused on language use what we want is high levels beyond symbolic function, right? And symbolic function, I mean a memorized speech, right? Or just introducing yourself in some kind of, space. And we're interested in peer groups, so children on children, adults together, but also in between those peer groups. And then secondly, we're really focused on intergenerational transmission. This is because if you're speaking at high levels, beyond symbolic function, in the most common domains throughout your community, and it's ever expanding, in between peer groups, you're a whole of a lot like you're way more likely to restore intergenerational transmission. It's not guaranteed for certain reasons, but it's way more likely. But in order to achieve those things, we have to overcome some really key challenges. But maybe they're not challenges, maybe they're more necessities that we need to do, that we need to make sure that we're engaging in. Some might look at them as challenges. And number one is devoting sufficient time to the language. Maybe I'm, speaking to the choir here, I don't know. But that's one. I'm going to talk about these in detail. Number two is acquisition through use in a cultural context. And I don't mean necessarily a traditional context of how things used to be or in a ceremonial context. I mean the modern day cultural and relevant context to Indigenous people. And three, cultivating a community of users or assimilating people into a community of users. I know people don't like that word in Canada, but I'm trying to think about it in the opposite direction. We're having trouble assimilating our own people into our language, into communities of our language. So devoting sufficient amount of time to the language. When we think about adults, it's been a challenge. This is because programs almost always never affect proficiency. This is apparent when you look at university programs. Or night classes, those kind of things that have existed for a long time in our communities. And the amount of time required can be overwhelming to program developers. Overwhelming because it just seems like so much, but overwhelming also economically, financially, to really ensure that you get enough time to become a proficient speaker. And I should also mention, I don't just mean time, I mean quality time. And of course, goals of programs are often not aligned with the time it is required to achieve those goals. So sometimes the goal will be to become a speaker, whatever that might mean to you, with night classes for 8 weeks, that kind of thing. And then people don't become speakers, and then people start to get down on themselves or feel like it's never going to happen, or it's a losing battle, when it's like, well, you are judging yourself inaccurately because you have set yourself up for failure in that way. So the second challenge is acquisition through use in a cultural context. And this is one thing that's especially challenging nowadays. So often highly resourced foreign language programs, like let's say French language programs at university, or Spanish or German for heritage language programs in Canada, for example, they even find developing high advanced proficiency in those languages a daunting task, even though those languages are spoken by millions. What they do to overcome this oftentimes is they depend on student travel to abroad, such as in Quebec, but also in other countries for their students to develop this high proficiency. When you think about that in the Indigenous context, travel to a homeland where we can travel to our homeland, of course, and to our Indigenous communities, but there's rarely that community of speakers there. So it's not an option for us oftentimes. And of course, in these acquisition through a cultural context is helped through resources being made to students to provide direction and skills for self-guided learning. And the third major challenge that I see is that cultivating a community of users. And this is maybe out of all these three that might be our biggest challenge. Alana Johns earlier, she was speaking about the three ladies who created Onkwawenna. This is something that they've done extremely well. maybe they didn't even intend for this to happen. Because we know that even creating a speaker, a really, really good speaker, doesn't guarantee intergenerational transmission if they don't talk to anybody, if they're not part of a community, right? Of course, in order for them to get to be a really good speaker, they'd likely have to be a part of a community at the same time. So teaching about language revitalization and providing linguistic skills on how to learn a language as well doesn't necessarily guarantee intergenerational transmission. So to seriously affect a language revitalization, programs really must directly use in a community or more than one communities. And I know some presenters today, they mentioned, hey, we don't even have a community. If that's the case, yeah, you're right, you have to make one, right? And if programs are successful at developing high proficiency among graduates, their parents, even the administrators, such programs then can help to assimilate other people into a speech community to develop this, threshold of people that's needed. And this requires intensifying, I should say, daily use. We notice that people who are very successful at becoming becoming speakers, they use it every single day. Especially these young adults, they're using it on Facebook. They're using it on their texting technologies. They're using it in their house. Right? They're using it everywhere that they possibly can to use it every day. And in expanding networks. And in doing so, this is helping to protect them from assimilation away into the dominant language, which in our case is usually English, but also French as well. So these challenges, or maybe necessities that we need to overcome, we're trying to address it with adult immersion. And I don't think we thought about those things when we started adult immersion. This, when I was a little kid, right? At the beginning, when adult immersion happened, it was about, hey, people want to learn, let's create an opportunity so that people can become speakers, and that's it, right? And then once you're done, we'll see what happens. There was not a whole lot of planning after that. But these are some things that I really noticed that we are addressing now to get closer and closer to realizing more sustained intergenerational transmission. So if you're familiar, the World Indigenous Nations Higher Education Consortium, what most people call WINHEC, they've recognized 5 ways higher education institutions, which you could say adult learning programs, let's call it that, can provide training for Indigenous languages. And one of those goals is for the language to become a marker or an emblem of one's identity. Hello, how are you? That kind of thing. My name is. Or maybe for land acknowledgement or something like that. In number 2, which is to revitalize internal ritual use, that kind of thing. 3, to maintain home and community use, or revitalize internal official Indigenous government use, or to make it a language of non-Indigenous people living on Indigenous land. Most adult programs in the history of our programs, whether they be on reserves or outside of reserves, have really been focused at these 2. That's it. Rarely do they go to the next step to revitalize, maintain home and community use. This is the major challenge that we're really seeing. So adult immersion, how are we overcoming this? How are we getting closer to that number 3? Restoring it in the home, in the community use. Well, one thing that Kentyohkwa, or Mohawk people, are becoming pretty well known for worldwide, and most Kentyohkwa or Mohawks don't know this, because you don't really know sometimes when you're right in it at the grassroots level. So we're actually becoming quite well known for our adult immersion programs. Sometimes being mentioned as some of the best ways for developing advanced proficiency in Indigenous languages anywhere in the world. And this first started in this small community in Wata back in '96, which much didn't come from that, but it led to an inspiration to have a new program here in Six Nations, and that's the one I mentioned, Onkwawenna Kentyohkwa. But we have others. We also have Radiwanahniirats, as I mentioned as well, in Kahnawake, who's also become an amazing program, putting out amazing second language speakers. So there's 3. We also used to, and I've maybe heard, maybe some here, I can see your names, you could mention if there's going to be another version of Sadiwana Garadas at Jijunhet Onkwawenna and Tainanego, who also had an adult immersion program going for years. We also had one in Buffalo at the Native, I forget what it's called, a Native American Center in Buffalo for urban Haudenosaunee or Iroquoian people to become fluent in Mohawk. And now there's another one in Ganasatake or in Oka, which some people call. So you're noticing a fast trend towards all our communities developing programs for adults. This is because most of these communities are really starting to realize that in order for children to become strong speakers, strong L1 or bilingual speakers, they need to have an environment, especially one in the home or in the school, that is through the language of Kentyohkwa, where people are interested in developing a community who define themselves through the use of the language, rather than merely just having the language as a tool, right, to use here and there. But no, to use it, and that use of it really becoming the centerpiece of your identity. And that's so great to see. So what, if you're not familiar with adult immersion, what is it anyway? Well, it kind of says it in the title, adult immersion. But generally, and this, all of our programs are slightly different, but they definitely are inspired by one another. And really what happens is that they're immersion from day one. And these are moment you walk in. And you'll notice that's what Brian talked about earlier today. And so far, there are 2 years in length, and I mean 2 full school years, basically September till May or June. 6 hours a day, Monday to Friday, basically a full-time job. Each year, it consists of about 1,000 hours of contact hours, accumulating to 2,000, of course, after 2 years. Another interesting thing to consider is that most of the time, 99% of the time, it's taught by other L2s or second language speakers who are highly proficient. And oftentimes the curriculum is structurally based, meaning looking at the linguistic underpinnings of the language, the morphology, the structure of the language as a way to guide curriculum. Oftentimes, this isn't something that we have used or Indigenous communities have used in the past, where they have relied on translating other curriculums for usually Indo-European languages, learning French, learning Spanish from English, whereas these programs are looking into the structure of Kentyohkwa or other Iroquoian languages and using that as a guide to best methods for increasing proficiency. So structurally based curriculum, simple to complex, moving up in a scaffolded way, and targeting principally oral proficiency, although other things like written and understanding and presentational, many things are focused on, but really the focus is on oral proficiency. And then methods, you can get into methods all day long about what actually happens in the classroom, but it's really all focused on comprehensible input, C+1 type, Stephen Krashen type methods, but really focusing on simple, compelling, interesting, and relevant language use every day in the classroom. Focus on creation of language and verb morphology, which some of us term as root words or root word method. And then, of course, we have a targeted demographic, which I mean adults, and especially young adults, and ideally young adults who have just had children or haven't had children yet. Adults who are going to have a large impact in the community later on by having the capacity to create an immersion environment in their home, or to help others, such as in the school and in other domains throughout the community. So that there is the, lack of a better phrase, biggest bang for your buck. So going back to these challenges, I'm going to give us a little bit of a, scorecard, for adult immersion, and think about from here, is technology helping us and is the pandemic ruining us? So devoting sufficient time to the language. Are we doing this? We definitely are, for the most part, not, but not completely. And what do I mean? Are we giving enough time to the language? Well, if you really want to create speakers. It really helps to know what a speaker is, and you have to define it for yourself, and for your language and what your goals want to get to, or where you want to get with your goals, I should say. And when you define what a speaker is, then you have to, figure out how much time it takes to get there. We figured this out from trial and error, from anecdotal evidence, and from doing it over and over and over again. So one thing we, really structure all these programs on is an oral proficiency interview. And many of us are trained in an oral, what we call OPI, oral proficiency interview, to give these interviews, which will kind of measure the oral proficiency of our students. And I'm not sure how my time is, Nick. I can't see anybody, my screen or anything.
Sorry.
I've got a few minutes. Do I have a little bit of time still?
Oh, 3 minutes.
3 minutes? Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm just about to finish. So, we are thinking about what proficiency do speakers actually need to acquire? How many people, who, and again, what are their goals? And our goals really are trying to develop advanced speakers, which is can narrate and describe in all major timeframes and handle, situations with complications. These oral proficiency interviews can help to assess students, instructors, and they can really help to even set community language standards. They must be measurable, and they must correspond with the time to achieve proficiency level. So goals, for example, our first year, intermediate low, our second year, advanced low. If we had a third year, which we are realizing we need one, advanced mid maybe a fourth year would get us a little bit higher. Comparing this to what the U.S. Foreign Service Institute has developed to show how hard it is or how long it takes to develop high proficiency in foreign languages, you'll notice that Spanish, because the United States really is interested in learning how to, for their military to become highly proficient in other languages, they've really determined how long it takes for different languages of different structures and cultures. Spanish only taking, around 600 hours of contact. Notice that Chinese, Japanese, Arabic take a whole lot more time. And I'm suggesting that languages like Mohawk, most languages in Canada, Indigenous languages, are likely the same, if not harder. Just because, things like different orthographies as well, but also because of large cultural differences in access to resources. So how much time? 1,000, 2,000, maybe 3,000, 4,000 hours. Sorry, Nick, I might go over 1 or 2 minutes. So just compare that to courses at the university. And this isn't to downplay your courses at the university because they have a different focus, but it's good to pinpoint that. Year 1, you get a 72 hours, you're at novice low. Year 2, you're still at novice low and you got 144 hours. Relative to our program in the community, this means you need 61 half-credit courses to get to 2,200 hours. So yes, we're devoting a sufficient amount of time, but we're also not. And this is what the young ladies who have developed Onkwawenna are helping to fix. And this is something that oddly, the pandemic seemingly has helped us with. Whereas when our graduates finish, places like Six Nations where we have no first language speakers left, it's hard for them to find new opportunities to speak it with others who are better at them. What those ladies have done is they've created nightly meetups with first language speakers and second language learners to get access to the language of high proficient language, right? Whereas pre-pandemic, people might not have even thought about doing anything like that. They might have thought, hey, I don't have anybody in my family and whatever, I'll just do whatever I need. And this is the challenge, is that when we finish and when those students finish, it's hard to find opportunities in real life, right? So our students sometimes will graduate with high proficiency, but because real life happens where they have to survive, it's very hard for them to continue on and to find speakers who are better than them, and to keep having that time in the language. What we are doing, which is hard for big institutions like universities to really do, is, and it's hard to do on Zoom, for example, is acquisition through use in a cultural context, right? Is to be in a relevant learning environment for students, right? We're doing that well with adult immersion when we're in class. We're doing things that are concerned with people's everyday life, right? We're in there in the community every day talking about things that are relevant to this group of people. As considering cultivating a community of users and then also assimilating new people into that, we're doing pretty well, because these speakers who are coming up are now becoming almost a family in certain ways, because they start to only talk to other people who speak the language. But at the same time, we're not doing so well. And yet this comes to the question whether, well, maybe that's the end point of adult immersion. There's new things that need to be focused on later, right? Because we can only set students up to learn so much at some point, and then we have to, set them free, so to speak. This is another thing that is amazing that those young ladies from Onkwawenna are doing, is that they are creating a community of users, right? Through use of Zoom meetings to develop, to spend time with first language speakers and other second language learners to develop a community around the use of the language. And we noticed that this is the reason why French medium education schools, such as those in Quebec and also throughout the world, throughout Canada, are so successful, is that they're focused on developing community through its use. And that's how they identify. Now, this is interesting because I wonder if we can think about how, in a way, the pandemic, for that reason, has brought us closer together rather than split us apart, right? Where now these elders are learning how to use Zoom, they're getting on, and they're getting, and students are getting access and connecting with those people to become ever more proficient students and speakers themselves. So I'm trying to look at it on the bright side in that way. So I think, we're doing well, and there's a lot to really to work on. So I'm pretty sure that this is the end of my presentation. Kentyohkwa, thank you very much, everybody, for hearing me out, and I'm more than happy to take some questions.
Kentyohkwa, Ryan. That was a wonderful presentation, and it was quite inspiring, especially to see the statistics of new L1 speakers, new child L1 speakers in communities that had a gap in transmission. And I think you've really highlighted what can be done, and also tied into one of the key themes that I was hoping to get after in this workshop, which is what the opportunities are for us. The tools that we've learned how to use are not going away when the pandemic does, but they're also no substitute for in-person practice, ultimately.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very, very much. And now we have about 10 minutes for questions. So
I see Shannon said something that's scary, how much she wrote. I'll try and read it.
whoa.
Thanks for the essay, Shannon. I'll read it right now. I'm just teasing. Shannon, did you want to maybe open your mic and just address that and ask it, or are you more comfortable with just writing it?
I can do that. That's not a problem.
Yeah, cool. Just so everybody can.
I was just busy typing my essay.
Yeah, that's fine.
So recently I had a reason to go to the Trudeau Fellowship Doctoral Scholarship website. And of course, this is a very prestigious award and has several different programs, including the Fellows Program and the Scholarship Program. And they have changed what they used to say, which was about the official languages of Canada. And they've added this section at the bottom that says that you have to commit to French and English, but you should also commit to becoming more familiar with Canada's Indigenous languages. And it was kind of just jumped out at me that this is one of those moments where sometimes there's potentially something that could be advocated for, because to me, this would be an opportune way to start creating more need for there to be greater chances for adult acquisition. And if it was in some of these very specific programs, then there would have to be, it would give people choices, and it would also support people like yourself and others who are learning as L2, but are from those communities originally. When, if you were to win said award, then you would be able to focus on that.
Right.
So it's a point, but I was just wondering, like, whether you thought there might be opportunities like that, or that might be interesting ways. I'm being political is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to be political. I love being political. But I think what Trudeau said, it's good that people become more familiar with Indigenous languages. You know, I think in a way that's his way of you know, saying that they're doing something with Indigenous language revitalization, but not really putting in the support that's fully needed. Not bringing Indigenous languages up to the same level of status as English and French, and not thinking outside of the box and ways to promote true language acquisition of our languages to highly proficient levels within our areas, right? So, and you know, I think there's their problem is that they approach it in the same way that they do with French and English, right? They look at the number of people that there are in Canada and how much money it would take to really support them. And they think, wow, there's 60 Indigenous languages, and that's too much money to really give over to all these languages. So, you know, we're just gonna give them lip service, in my opinion. Of course, there's a little bit more money going towards it now, and we hope to see some money coming down the drain in that way, or coming down the pipe, I should say, maybe down the drain as well. I think, I guess that's all I have to say about that, Shannon, because I don't really know how to answer your question further. But I appreciate your point.
We also have a question from Eliana Parker, who's curious as to your thoughts about transitioning from proficiency to use. As you said, one doesn't automatically lead to the other. What are you seeing to be really effective in increasing actual use throughout various domains?
Right. Great point. So it's a funny thing, right? So use and proficiency. For you to become proficient, you need to use it, right? And generally you're not finding somebody, you know, kind of using that as a point. You're rarely finding an individual who's become proficient without any kind of dependence on a community, right, or other speakers, right? And you'll notice that one of the reasons that adult immersion is effective is that it's creating a community of speakers who are supportive, but also in an environment where there's no other choice, right? And I think that was mentioned today, that it's almost, you know, you have to remember that our brains as humans, we kind of want to do what's easiest to get our carbohydrates and survive, right? So if we also have to learn a language at the same time, we're probably not going to do it if we're already struggling. And, you know, that's why we're creating environments where it's almost like putting somebody on a remote island with a total different population speaking another language, that where you have to learn that language in order to get your necessities, right, in order to survive. And that kind of environment, creating that, creates eventually a community of users who can depend on each other, where it's not just random people becoming proficient and then going on in their everyday lives. This is the challenge where some of our students, and I think in the naive way where adult immersion programs, when they were developed, thought too, is that we'll just create speakers and then they'll go on in their everyday life and something will happen and it'll all work out. And that's kind of often what happens, unfortunately, is some speakers will become speakers. And then, like I said, life happens. They need to get a job. They need to pay for the bills. They need to pay the bills. They need to do all these things. And then they kind of put it on the side, right? And that there needs to be more mechanisms afterward or built into programming that develops cohesion, social cohesion. And this is a sense of trust, love, respect, you know, and dependence and interdependence among your community, the people in your community. And if you're from an Indigenous community or spent a lot of time in those places, you notice that's damn hard to do sometimes, right? Because of many reasons that we, you know, can talk about at another time. And we're noticing that programs that where we have excess time with one another, like adult immersion programs, whether it be online or off, that we have an opportunity to create that kind of atmosphere, but we also have the risk of not, right? Because we can set it ourselves up where we're with each other all the time, and then we, at the end of the year, we never want to see each other again, right? So there is a risk as well, and many of us have gone through that. So ideally, you are involving in what you're building within your curriculum, where students are getting involved with everything in throughout the community. You know, they're volunteering in local schools. They're volunteering and spending time speaking the language in local organizations. They're developing signage in the community, and they're kind of working to spread it throughout, and not just doing their own thing as individuals. I hope I answered your question there.
Thank you. And we've got another question from Drew, who says, in Ireland, we're now struggling with L2 speakers who are proficient in teaching their children or at schools who haven't properly learned Gaelic grammar or word choice, etc. Many people end up sounding like they're speaking English with Irish words. This is now causing issues where native speakers of traditional varieties struggle to understand these new speakers. Have yourselves taken any steps to make sure this isn't happening in the adult immersion programs?
I say yes and no. So the thing is that the foundation is doing what's most expedient, of course, because we're running out of time. So one of our criticisms is our focus, which is why. Well, the first problem is with languages like Mohawk, which are very morphologically complex, meaning especially in the fact that we have unlimited words. If they're, in these polysynthetic languages where you can create unlimited words, meaning, your dictionary could be all the way to the sky and back, and you still haven't created all the words. That means that you can't teach students every word. So what you have to do is approach it by teaching them the rules of morphology, phonological change, so on and so forth, without telling them that, giving them the patterns, right? So that why teach them 1,000 words when you could teach them 10 rules that are going to give them the capacity to create those 1,000 words on their own. Now, that's a really expedient way of doing it. However, what it does, as you know, Drew, as many linguists would know, is that what would happen is that there'd be many words that students create that, even though they're grammatically correct, they're just not what people say. Or they'll start saying things like, they'll start calquing oddly, right? And they'll start saying sayings that are from English and into Gaelic or Mohawk, what have you, that are just not, not said in that language, and it sounds weird, like they're speaking English through Gaelic. Definitely, we have that as a huge problem, especially at the beginning, right? And usually at the beginning, we do our best to let that slide, and mention, it's a good word, but you don't say that kind of thing. And then later on, it's through greater access to highly proficient speakers. And it's, I think, a problem that we're all experiencing. And there's a gray area to which you want to allow that to happen so that second language speakers can speak in a relevant way to their lives, right? Because they're also existing in a world that was different than the old people, right? So being able to create with language and to say things that are more aligned with their experience. So is that something that the elders just didn't say, or is awkward grammar, or is it a good word? And now that's a big challenge. So there's a difference there. It's not something we've all overcome, but the people who have overcome it, who have become really proficient and gotten out of that, are those who have spent time a lot with the older speakers and speakers who are better than them. So increasing those opportunities are great. And that also kind of brings up the importance of documentation, right? Is that once our old people are gone, there's that real quality language is going to be gone with them. So we really need to be doing our best to be recording these speakers and making that available and embedding it within our curriculums. I hope I answer your question there, Drew.
And we've got a question from, or a comment from Louis-Jacques Doré, who says, Kentyohkwa, I worked with the Wendat Nation some years ago on the Onkwawenna project for reviving their language, and they found it essential to teach adult classes first, a year or so before starting a course in elementary school. So precisely in line with what,
Yeah, that's good. Awesome.
And then there's a comment from Mario Zil, who says, environments where children still learn Indigenous languages as first languages today in Canada are such that there's little reward for fluency, especially if the colonial language is not mastered.
Well said.
I wonder if I could follow up too on Drew's question, and to say that you know, the go-to example that everybody cites of spectacularly successful language revitalization is, of course, Israeli Hebrew. And Israeli Hebrew has profound differences from classical Hebrew in its pronunciation, in its word order, in every aspect of its structure. But it is being spoken by millions of people from nothing. It was used only as a ritual and scholarly language for a couple of thousand years, and now it's got millions of L1 speakers. So I think that there's a trap that that some of us fall into, both speakers and linguists too, despite linguists. Despite the way we profess to be devoted to descriptive rather than prescriptive attitudes to grammar, I think there's a trap we can often fall into where we say, well, it has to be the way older generations have spoken it. But there's no language that stays still until there are no speakers left. And the main point, in my opinion anyway, is that if the language is being spoken, it is going to change.
Yeah.
And knowing how to create words and knowing how to create sentences is going to keep the language alive, even if it sounds a little different.
Well said. And I think the experience was similar with the Hawaiians as well, where they had, tons of newspapers and curriculums all developed before the 1900s, 19th century, all in Hawaiian. And, it was late in the early 1900s, mid 1900s, where they lost most of their speakers. And to this day, they use a lot of that old written language up to today. And of course, the language has probably changed quite a bit. And it's one of those challenges we experience as Indigenous people a lot, as we are always balancing between, being ultra conservative and letting things change, right? And I find more often than not being ultra conservative to set up more obstacles than to create more positive implications for our language in the long run. That's for sure. Even things like using linguistics to help us teach the language could, for some, be thought of as colonial, right? Because it wasn't the way that the old people learned, right? Or the first language speakers learned. And of course, we have figured out that you can learn that way, but it will take you, 10 times as long. So it's up to people to choose and do the best they can. Yeah.
And we have a comment from Chris Harvey.
Sure. I'm going to push back, Nick, a bit.
Okay.
If I can. Friendly and smiling. That one of the issues with interference from the dominant language that occurs in, let's say, Indigenous North American languages or Celtic languages is that it's all coming from a single source. Right, so all of the interference coming, let's say, into Kentyohkwa is coming pretty much all through English, and you have English speakers learning a second language, or English speakers learning Mohican or Welsh or whatever. So all of this interference is coming from a single place, and it starts to dominate. There's certain like hybrid languages around in Wales, and we would sort of jokingly talk it, where you just take English words and stick them with a Welsh accent with Welsh grammar, doing talking Welsh and good, achi, that kind of thing. And it's different from in Hebrew, where it kind of evolved as from either, Yiddish was there and Judezmo was there, but it did a languagey thing, and it went off on its own. Whereas I think languages surrounded by a dominant colonial language need to be constantly aware of learners doing translation speech. Because if they have the English in their head and then they use the native words on top of their English grammar, it's a sign that they're not thinking in the native language. They're being a translator in their head. And if you're a translator, you'll never reach English, yeah. You'll never reach a fluency, you know, whatever your goal in fluency is, because being a translator is exhausting, and you get headaches and you get tired and you burn out. Whereas when you're thinking in a language, everything flows really smoothly and you start creating those new words on the fly without thinking. So I like to think that you got to nip these sort of English encoders and translators in the bud at the beginning, and you can do that by not giving English translations to things, right? So instead of saying, well, Ismailam, it means I like it, but really what it means, or you know, and so they've learned that through English, and so every time they want to say that they like something, they think it in English first, and then they translate it in their head, and then it comes out. And you can really see people struggling with their second language because they're doing these translations in their head. So anyway, that was just my pushback, is that it's not like we should all be speaking thou and thee again in English, because damn it, we have to stop change from happening. But it's be on the lookout, but the difference between change and English with indigenous words pasted on top.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
Anyway, great talk. Thank you.
Thanks for listening.
All right. Thank you very much, Ryan, and everyone for the comments and questions. We now have our last 5-minute break before we will hear Jordan Locklear, our final speaker.